Emily walked into the stark white hospital room, her breath catching as though the air had been stolen. The monitor's beeping slowed, then fell silent. She froze, her heart crashing against her ribs. A doctor looked at her with tired eyes and said softly, "I'm sorry. There's nothing more we can do." Her knees buckled, and the room spun as grief clawed through her chest. Emily's trembling hands clutched the cold rail of the hospital bed. Her son lay motionless, his small frame dwarfed by wires and machines. She whispered, "No, please, not my boy." The weight of despair pinned her down, and her scream shattered the sterile silence. She collapsed against the bed, pressing her face into the sheets, as if holding on would keep him here. Tears blurred her vision, blinding her to everything except the unbearable emptiness. In that moment, Emily's world collapsed. She had nothing left but pain, loss, and the echo of love torn away. Emily staggered out of the hospital, hours later, her body numb and her soul shredded. The night air cut through her like shards of glass. She clutched her coat tightly, but no fabric could shield her from the cold inside. Her mind replayed the doctor's words again and again, each syllable a dagger. She whispered to herself, "It's not real. He'll wake up. He has to." But silence answered, heavier than any storm. She wandered into the parking lot, streetlights flickering dimly above her. Cars passed by, their engines indifferent to her grief. She leaned against a lamppost, her legs giving way, tears falling onto the cracked asphalt. Her chest ached, as if every breath was punishment. The world moved on without her, and she felt invisible, like a shadow fading in the night. For Emily, the world had ended in that room, and nothing outside could ever feel alive again. Emily returned home to a silent apartment that once echoed with laughter. The walls seemed to press inward, heavy with memories she could not bear. A toy truck lay forgotten on the floor, mocking her emptiness. She picked it up, clutching it to her chest, whispering, "This is all I have left of you." Her sobs echoed in the hollow rooms. She stumbled into the bedroom, collapsing onto the bed, still clutching the toy. The sheets smelled faintly of her son's innocence, and that scent tore her apart. She pressed her face into the pillow, wishing to vanish into the past. The weight of absence crushed her, a silence louder than any scream. For Emily, every object was a reminder, every breath a betrayal of the life she had lost. Alone in the dark, she begged for the impossible. One more moment, one more laugh, one more heartbeat. Morning light crept reluctantly into Emily's apartment, but she remained unmoved, her body wrapped in the same clothes from the night before. She dragged herself to the kitchen, where unpaid bills cluttered the table, each envelope a silent accusation. She poured cold coffee into a chipped mug, her hands trembling as she tried to sip. Her reflection in the window startled her, hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and a face carved by grief. She muttered, "You're not even yourself anymore." The silence of the apartment pressed against her, and she longed for a voice to break it. She sat heavily at the table, staring at the pile of bills, knowing she couldn't face them. Her world was already broken, and life's cruel demands mocked her suffering. Every moment without her son felt unbearable, and every breath a reminder that she had to endure the unendurable. Later that day, Emily's phone buzzed with messages from family members she had not spoken to in months. Each message felt like a dagger, words dripping with judgment instead of comfort. One read, "You should have done more." Another said, "This is your burden to carry." Emily's hand shook as she dropped the phone onto the couch. She whispered bitterly, "They were never there for me. Not when I needed them." The loneliness deepened, twisting her grief into anger. She paced the small apartment, her voice cracking as she cried out, "Why did they turn their backs? Why did everyone leave?" Her heart ached not just for her son, but for the love she had lost long before. She collapsed again on the couch, curling into herself, drowning in despair. In her silence, only betrayal and abandonment kept her company. The morning sun rose with cruel brightness, cutting into Emily's weary eyes as she dragged herself from bed. Her body felt heavy, as though grief had stitched weights into her bones. She forced herself into her work uniform, its fabric stiff and lifeless. Each button closed was another reminder of the endless cycle she was trapped in. Her son's laughter once filled these mornings, but now the silence pressed hard against her chest. She stepped out into the street, where buses roared and strangers rushed by, none aware of her breaking world. "Keep moving," she whispered, her voice a fragile command to herself. The city moved fast, but Emily dragged her feet, weighed down by sorrow and exhaustion. She carried her bag like a burden, its strap biting into her shoulder. Every step felt like betrayal, leaving behind the memory of her child, yet she had no choice. She had to survive. Inside the diner where Emily worked, the clatter of dishes and chatter of customers felt like sharp echoes stabbing her mind. She plastered on a hollow smile as she poured coffee, her hands trembling slightly. The smell of grease and burnt toast clung to the air, suffocating her. A young couple laughed in a booth, their joy twisting inside her like a cruel reminder. "Anything else?" she asked mechanically, her voice void of life. She moved from table to table, each step more robotic than the last. Her manager barked instructions from the counter, indifferent to the sadness etched into her face. She forced herself to focus, but every moment felt like surviving fire with no escape. The tray she carried shook under its weight, her body threatening to collapse with every passing second. This job wasn't her choice. It was survival, a fragile thread keeping her afloat in a storm she couldn't escape. That night, Emily sat alone in her living room, clutching an old photo album. Her fingers traced the images of family gatherings now poisoned by betrayal. She remembered the day her mother turned away, saying coldly, "You brought this on yourself." Those words rang in her ears even now, louder than her heartbeat. The faces in the photographs stared back, frozen in smiles that no longer belonged to her. Her hands shook as she closed the book, pressing it against her chest. She whispered, "Why wasn't love enough?" The silence gave no answer. Her family had been her anchor once, but now their absence was a wound that refused to close. She curled up on the couch, holding the album as if it could replace the arms that once embraced her. But all it gave her was a reminder of love, lost and the cruel emptiness left behind. Sleep offered no escape. Emily lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling above her bed, her body trembling with exhaustion. Memories clawed at her, whispers of laughter and warmth now twisted into reminders of loss. She pressed her hands against her ears, as if she could block them out, but the silence screamed louder. She sat up suddenly, gasping for air, as if drowning in her own sorrow. "I can't do this," she muttered, her voice cracked and broken. Her reflection in the mirror across the room caught her eye, a hollow shell of the woman she once was. Dark circles clung under her eyes, and despair hollowed her cheeks. She walked to the mirror, touching the glass as though searching for herself on the other side. All she saw was emptiness staring back. The night dragged on endlessly, each hour heavy with the weight of grief she could not shake. As dawn crept in, Emily sat at the kitchen table, the silence pressing down harder than ever. Bills spread before her, unpaid and accusing. Her hand shook as she scribbled numbers on a notepad, realizing she had nothing left. "How am I supposed to keep going?" she whispered, her voice small. The weight of survival crushed her, heavier than grief itself. Hunger twisted in her stomach, but she ignored it. The clock ticked endlessly, each sound mocking her desperation. She pressed her forehead against the table, her breath shaky, as tears slid silently down her face. Her life had shrunk to numbers, bills, and empty hours. She longed for comfort, but found only cold silence. With her son gone and her family turned away, she had nothing but herself to fight with. And even that strength felt like it was slipping away faster each day. Emily sat by her son's bed as his weak cough rattled through the silence. His small chest rose and fell with effort, each breath pulling at her heart. She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, whispering, "It's going to be okay, sweetheart." Her words trembled, betraying her fear. Medical bills stacked on the table beside her, their numbers screaming louder than her own thoughts. The doctor had said treatment was possible, but expensive. Emily's hands shook as she ran her fingers through her son's hair, desperate to comfort him though she could barely comfort herself. She rocked slightly, as though motion could soothe her panic. Her heart begged for strength, but her mind drowned in worry. She kissed his forehead and murmured, "I won't let you down. I'll find a way." Though her voice cracked, determination flickered through the storm of despair. The next morning, Emily stood at the kitchen counter, unpaid bills spread across the surface like a cruel puzzle. Her fingers traced the red numbers stamped with urgency. Her chest tightened as she whispered, "How can I choose between food and medicine?" Her son's weak cough echoed from the bedroom, a reminder that time was slipping away. She picked up the phone, dialing the hospital, her hand trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. A flat voice on the other end explained costs, insurance denials, and payments she could never make. Emily pressed her forehead to the wall, her tears dripping onto the phone. "Please, there has to be another way," she begged, but the silence that followed crushed her hope. She hung up, sliding to the floor, arms wrapped around herself, the weight of desperation suffocating her from all sides. At the diner, Emily struggled to stay upright as exhaustion weighed on her. The tray in her hands shook dangerously, plates rattling as she moved from one booth to the next. Her manager's voice cut through the noise, sharp and impatient. "Move faster, Emily." She bit her lip, forcing herself forward though her body screamed for rest. A customer's dismissive glance stung like a slap, their impatience clear as she fumbled with the check. She smiled weakly, masking the storm inside. Behind the counter, her manager scowled, muttering complaints loud enough for her to hear. Emily's shoulders slumped under invisible weight, but she whispered to herself, "Don't stop. He needs you." The clatter of dishes, the heat of the kitchen, the sting of her manager's glare, all blurred into a haze of despair she carried silently, praying no one would see her breaking. That night, Emily sat on her bed, her body shaking from exhaustion. She stared at the crumpled paper in her hands, a letter from her estranged father. His words cut into her. "We warned you. Don't come to us now." She read it over and over, each line heavier than the last. Her throat burned as she whispered, "Why wasn't I worth saving?" She pressed the letter to her chest before tearing it apart, her hands trembling with anger and grief. Shredded pieces scattered onto the floor, fluttering like fallen leaves. She collapsed backward on the bed, her arms spread as if surrendering to the emptiness. Tears streamed down her face, soaking into the pillow. She closed her eyes, haunted by voices that reminded her she was alone. The silence pressed harder, but inside her chest, a fire of defiance flickered faintly. She would endure, even if no one stood beside her. The following day, Emily sat alone in the waiting room of the hospital, a folder of paperwork clutched against her chest. The sterile air reeked of antiseptic, and the faint beeping of machines carried through the hall. Around her, families whispered, their hands intertwined in comfort. She sat apart, invisible, her fingers tightening on the folder until her knuckles whitened. Her son's cough echoed in her mind, every sound tearing her further apart. A receptionist called her name, her tone flat and businesslike. Emily rose slowly, her legs heavy, as though each step dragged her deeper into despair. She whispered, "Stay strong," though her voice was barely audible. Inside, fear roared louder than her words. As she followed the nurse down the hallway, her shoulders hunched, her breath shaky, she knew she had no shield left, only the fragile hope of saving her child against impossible odds. Emily sat across from her sister in a dimly lit cafe, the smell of burnt coffee lingering between them. Her sister's voice carried more venom than compassion as she hissed, "You always make things worse. You're drowning in this because you never listen." The words pierced Emily like knives, reopening wounds that never healed. She clenched her fists beneath the table, her voice shaking as she said, "I lost everything. How can you still blame me?" Her sister's face hardened, lips pressed thin, eyes unflinching. Emily felt her breath catch, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the chatter around them. She wanted to reach across the table and beg for warmth, but the wall between them had grown too thick. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with years of betrayal. Tears brimmed in Emily's eyes, but she refused to let them fall, whispering instead, "I just needed family." The argument spilled outside, the cold night air wrapping around Emily like chains. Her sister's words echoed, "You'll always be alone." Emily staggered onto the sidewalk, her chest tight, vision blurred. Streetlights flickered above as her tears streaked down her cheeks. She whispered through broken sobs, "Why wasn't I enough?" She leaned against a brick wall, her body trembling violently. Strangers walked past, their eyes averted, their pace hurried, indifferent to her unraveling. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, the weight of rejection pressing harder than grief itself. She clutched her coat tightly, her arms wrapped around her chest as if holding herself together. Every word from her sister replayed like poison, corroding her from the inside. She pressed her hand against her mouth, muffling a scream that clawed to escape. The city roared around her, but in Emily's world, only silence and betrayal remained. Later that night, Emily sat in her small apartment with her closest friend, Claire de Warichtal. The warmth of tea steamed between them, but Emily's hands shook too much to hold the cup. Claire reached out, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You don't have to carry this alone," she whispered. Emily shook her head, tears threatening to spill as she muttered, "I don't even know how to breathe anymore." Claire squeezed her hand tightly, her presence a fragile lifeline in the storm. Emily longed to collapse fully, to allow someone to hold her together, but fear anchored her heart. The silence between them carried the weight of unspoken truths. Emily finally whispered, "I can't let him down. He deserves more than this broken version of me." Claire's eyes softened as she said, "You're not broken, you're surviving." For the first time in days, Emily felt a flicker of warmth pierce the cold. As Emily tried to rest, memories clawed back into her mind. She saw flashes of her son's laughter, then the sound of machines, then the stillness of his small body. She bolted upright, gasping, her heart hammering like a drum. Her hands clutched the sheets as tears streamed uncontrollably. "Why couldn't I save you?" she cried into the silence, her voice breaking. She pressed her face into the pillow, muffling her sobs, her body curling inward as though trying to vanish. The darkness around her seemed to press tighter, suffocating. She could almost hear his voice in the room, soft and playful, yet it faded like smoke. Emily's sobs turned into deep, aching silence, her chest aching with the absence she couldn't escape. The weight of grief dragged her deeper into despair, her mind tormented by what was lost and what could never return. Morning came with gray skies, heavy and oppressive, as Emily trudged to work. Her body moved mechanically, but her spirit felt hollow. Inside the diner, the smell of grease made her stomach churn. A customer snapped, "You're late again," their tone laced with disdain. Emily bit her tongue, her voice weak as she replied, "I'm sorry." Her manager shot her a glare sharp enough to pierce, muttering about her being unreliable. She tried to steady her trembling hands as she poured coffee, the liquid spilling onto the counter. Humiliation burned her cheeks, her heart racing with shame. Every voice around her seemed to sneer, every eye a judgment she couldn't bear. She whispered beneath her breath, "I can't fall apart. Not now." Yet inside, she was already breaking, her heart splintering under the weight of a world determined to crush her. Emily sat in the hospital room, papers scattered on her lap. Her heart pounded as she listened to the doctor's quiet words. The illness wasn't natural. We found something unusual in his system. She blinked rapidly, trying to comprehend, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "What do you mean?" The doctor's gaze dropped, avoiding her eyes before muttering, "It points to outside interference." Emily's stomach twisted violently, nausea rising as dread carved its way into her chest. The world blurred around her, the walls seeming to close in. Her fingers clenched the papers so tightly they crumpled. She struggled to breathe, her mind racing. Someone had done this. Someone had hurt her son. The thought was unbearable, a knife that cut deeper than any loss she had known. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "Who would do this?" Silence answered, heavier than stone. Emily walked home in a daze, the words echoing endlessly in her head. Each step felt heavier, her body trembling as the truth gnawed at her. She muttered, "Someone hurt him, someone I trusted." Her vision blurred with tears, her hands clutching her coat tightly. She reached her apartment, collapsing onto the couch, her sobs violent and uncontrollable. Every memory replayed through a darker lens, every smile tainted by suspicion. "Why?" she screamed, her voice raw, breaking into silence. The walls around her seemed to echo her pain, closing in with suffocating weight. She dug her nails into her arms, grounding herself against the spiral of panic. Betrayal clawed at her heart, shredding the last threads of trust she had clung to. She whispered into the emptiness, "I can't survive this." But deep inside, anger flickered, rage that someone had stolen her son's life. The next day, Emily confronted her closest friend Claire, suspicion burning through her grief. "You were the only one who knew, the only one with access," she accused, her voice trembling with rage. Claire's eyes widened, her hands raised in denial. "Emily, I would never." But the words felt hollow, bouncing against Emily's breaking trust. Her chest heaved as she stepped closer, her voice cracking. "Then why does everything point to you?" Claire's tears fell quickly, her voice pleading, "I tried to help you. I swear." Emily's mind spun, torn between years of friendship and the unbearable thought of betrayal. Her fists clenched, her breathing sharp, as silence thickened between them. She turned away, whispering bitterly, "I don't know who to believe anymore." The room grew colder, as if trust itself had shattered, leaving only suspicion and pain in its place. Alone again, Emily sat at the edge of her bed, her body quaking with grief and fury. She replayed every word, every moment, searching for truth in the chaos. Her son's laughter haunted her, mingling with the doctor's revelation. She pressed her hands into her face, muffling her sobs. "How do I forgive? How do I live?" she cried into the silence. The questions tore through her like knives, leaving no answer. Her reflection in the mirror across the room looked unrecognizable, eyes hollow, cheeks sunken, spirit fractured. She rose, stepping closer to the mirror, touching its cold surface as if trying to reach the woman she once was. But all she saw was a stranger, broken by loss and betrayal. She whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." In that fragile moment, she realized the fight ahead wasn't just against others, it was against the darkness inside herself. Emily returned to the hospital, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She stared at her son's empty bed, the sheets tucked tightly as if waiting for someone who would never return. She whispered, "I'll find the truth, I promise you." Her voice cracked, breaking into silence. The sterile smell of disinfectant burned her throat as she sat heavily in the chair beside the bed. Her fingers clutched the blanket, pulling it to her chest as if it carried his memory. Tears streamed silently, her breathing shallow, each inhale like shards of glass. The weight of betrayal, grief and loneliness crashed together, suffocating her. But somewhere deep within, a spark ignited, a fragile vow born from love and despair. Emily lifted her head, her voice soft but firm. "I won't let them win. For you, I'll keep fighting." The room stayed silent, but in her heart, determination began to rise. Emily stood in the doorway of Claire's apartment, her fists trembling at her sides. The weight of betrayal pressed heavy in her chest. "You knew, didn't you?" she demanded, her voice sharp, cracking with rage and pain. Claire's face paled, eyes wide, hands raised as if warding off a blow. "Emily, please, I didn't hurt him," she begged, her voice desperate. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as Emily stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Her voice dropped into a whisper, trembling with fury. "Then tell me why it points to you." The silence stretched like a blade between them. Claire's body shook, her words stumbling over guilt and denial. Emily's heart raced so hard, she felt it in her throat. The confrontation burned through her, anger warring with grief, leaving her standing on the edge of collapse. The argument escalated, voices colliding like thunder. Emily's words were sharp, each one jagged with grief. "You were supposed to protect us, not destroy us," she shouted, her voice raw and breaking. Claire sobbed, clutching her chest, her words tumbling over themselves. I tried, Emily. I tried to save him. Emily's vision blurred with tears, her chest rising and falling violently. She gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into the wood. The air between them crackled with years of trust unraveling in seconds. Claire's face twisted with pain, her eyes pleading for belief, but Emily's rage blinded her to compassion. For a moment, silence broke through, filled only with the sound of their shallow breathing. Emily turned her back, whispering, I can't even look at you. Her voice carried finality, cutting like glass, shattering what was left of their bond. Emily stormed out into the night, the cold air biting her skin. Her breath came fast, fogging in the chill as her tears froze on her cheeks. She pressed her back against a wall, her body shaking with rage and despair. She screamed into the emptiness, her voice cracking, echoing against silent streets. Why him? Why my boy? Her sobs racked her body, hands clawing at her coat. She slid down the wall until she sat on the sidewalk, her knees pulled to her chest. Streetlights buzzed above, flickering faintly, their glow a weak companion to her grief. She pressed her face into her knees, whispering broken prayers to the night sky. Inside, her anger and love twisted together, a storm that refused to quiet. Though shattered, a small ember flickered, one that whispered she had to fight, no matter how impossible it seemed. Emily returned home, her body trembling, her spirit cracked but not shattered. She stared at the mirror, her reflection barely recognizable, a woman broken but not defeated. She whispered, You have to keep going. For him. Her voice shook, but a fragile thread of strength wove through the despair. She wiped her face, her red eyes glaring back at herself with a mix of fury and resolve. The past clawed at her, but the present demanded survival. She lit a small candle on the table, its flame trembling like her heart. The room filled with soft glow, shadows dancing on the walls. She sat in silence, letting the light steady her breathing. For the first time in weeks, she felt a quiet clarity. The battle wasn't only with others, it was with herself. She had to rise from despair or be consumed forever. Days later, Emily confronted the truth, head-on. Standing at the hospital, she demanded answers from the doctor once more. Tell me everything, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear trembling beneath. The doctor hesitated, then spoke in clipped tones. The evidence suggests deliberate tampering, someone close. Emily's chest tightened, her heart pounding, but instead of collapsing, she inhaled sharply, letting the words harden her resolve. Then I'll find out who, she declared. The room fell silent, her voice lingering in the sterile air like steel. Grief had carved her hollow, but determination began to fill the cracks. She clenched her fists, her breathing steadying. In that moment, she chose not to remain the broken mother in despair. She chose to rise, no matter how painful the path ahead. Emily sat quietly in her living room, the silence now less suffocating, more contemplative. She held a small notebook, writing words she had never spoken aloud. I forgive, not for them, but for me. Her hand trembled as she wrote, yet each word steadied her heart. Memories of her son filled the space, his laugh, his curious eyes, the way his hand fit into hers. She pressed the notebook against her chest, tears sliding down, but softer than before. The pain remained, but it no longer consumed her. She whispered into the empty room, I'll carry you with me always. The candle burned faintly beside her, its flame reflecting in her wet eyes. In the quiet, Emily realized she was still here, scarred but alive. Forgiveness wasn't forgetting, it was surviving. In the hospital, Emily sat by her son's bed once more, though it lay empty of his presence. She rested her hand on the blanket, imagining his tiny fingers curling around hers. I love you, she whispered, her voice fragile but unwavering. The emptiness still burned, but this time it was tempered by gratitude for the love she once held. She sat in silence, breathing slowly, letting the quiet wrap around her like a fragile embrace. For the first time, the pain and love existed together, neither overwhelming the other. She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against the bed, as if sharing one last secret. Her heart ached, but her voice steadied. "I'll keep going for both of us." At the park, Emily walked slowly, the crisp autumn air brushing against her cheeks. Children laughed in the distance, their voices tugging at her heart, but she did not crumble. She sat on a bench, gazing at the golden leaves drifting down. An older man, a kind stranger, sat beside her, striking conversation. His gentle voice reminded her of resilience. "Pain changes us, but it doesn't have to end us," he said softly. Emily smiled faintly, her eyes damp but grateful. She whispered, "Maybe that's the lesson I needed." The conversation lingered with her long after he left, leaving her heart lighter. She exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of grief ease slightly. For the first time, she let herself imagine a tomorrow that wasn't only filled with pain. Emily found herself smiling faintly at the man who had entered her life in unexpected ways. He wasn't grand or dramatic, just steady, kind, and patient. His presence felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. "Over coffee," he said gently. "You deserve to be loved again." Her heart trembled at the words, her first instinct to recoil, but instead, she let them linger. She met his eyes, her voice a whisper. "I don't know if I can." He reached across the table, his hand resting over hers, warmth flowing through the simple gesture. Emily's chest tightened, her grief still present, but softened by the possibility of something new. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. The world seemed less cruel, less dark, and she allowed herself a fragile, hopeful smile. That night, Emily sat beside her window, gazing at the stars. Her hands rested on the notebook, now filled with words of grief, forgiveness, and hope. She whispered softly, "I would do it all again. For you I would." The room was silent except for her steady breathing. Tears glistened, but her face was serene, no longer crumbling under despair. She pressed the notebook to her chest, her heart heavy yet unshackled. Outside, the night sky shimmered, vast and endless, echoing the love that still lived within her. She closed her eyes, feeling her son's memory woven into her very being. For the first time, silence brought peace. Emily smiled faintly, whispering one last promise. "I'll carry you with me, always."